Welcome to Turpentine Diaries, everyone. As somebody who enjoys art, or perhaps you're an artist, how many times do you visit a museum in a year? Every day? Probably not. Once a month? I go uh, about once a week. Um, I've been doing that now for 6 or 7 years. In the past, actually, when I lived in New York City and lived in Manhattan or Brooklyn, I visited museums more frequently. As an artist, clearly you go to a museum in part to learn, and I do. I visit and I live in Northeast Ohio, so I visit the Cleveland Museum of Art, as I said, about once a week, and I study. And I study. I examine these paintings sometimes. Every week. Some of them I visit every time I'm there. So I really study these paintings. I recommend that all artists or art students do this. It's sometimes surprising to hear from other artists or art students. They're surprised that I visit the museums so frequently, regularly. But I think it's important. You have to develop your eyes. You have to interact with your peers and your predecessors and try to open dialogues with them. And in some ways, that's what looking at art is, a dialogue between you and the creator of the work. So learning and studying, important as it is not the prime reason one goes. If you're not an artist, those considerations mean nothing to you, except in an auxiliary way. Some of us, I include myself in this, look at paintings. We have to. It's like breathing. It's like eating. It's part of life. It's a necessity. And that might sound strange, I suppose, to those listeners who don't have this interest. To me, it's just obvious and completely understandable and reasonable. But I suppose if this isn't that way to you, then how to explain this? When you look at a painting, you're looking at a reality that has no words. And that is deeper view of reality to me than reading or other types of communication. If you look from wherever you are right now, if you look around your room or you look out the window and down the street or across the woods or wherever you might be, there are no words. Yet, whatever you see is filled with portent and meaning, isn't it? And it's filled with life and all kinds of mysteries. And this might sound romantic or, I don't know, naive. And in some ways, I think it is. And that, though, to me, this kind of just naive, open to the world view is the heart of art. To have a sense of adventure and excitement when you see a work of art is important. It's an important quality to, and especially if you're an artist, to have that. When you start a painting, you start with that sense of adventure. When you're young, you have the whole world ahead of you and your whole life to discover things, and inevitably you'll learn that some of the things that you discover have been discovered before you, and what you think is a wonderful insight is a commonplace. And as we get older, perhaps that enjoyment, that thrill of discovery lessens. For some of us, that doesn't happen. As we get older, the thrill, maybe thrill is not the word, but the excitement and the enjoyment of it remains and actually grows deeper and resonates. So with that as a backdrop, I think it's pretty easy to understand why someone might need to go to the museum and commune with these works of art from all places and all times. And luckily, I have my issues with the Cleveland Museum of Art, but luckily the museum is a top flight museum. The Asian collection especially is probably the best in the United States. And It's large enough that they rotate works all the time, and so frequently you'll see things you've never seen before, even if you go to the museum every week for 7 years. But even if they didn't rotate it, I would still be going there. The combination of studying the works and enjoying the works never ceases to draw me and fulfill me. So for a small cadre of us, museums serve this vital, life-giving function. Now, the next few things I'm going to say are not directly directed at the Cleveland Museum art. Whatever issues I have with them, I might address some other time, but this is just a more general observations. The museums, art museums especially, are very alert to trends in culture, of course, that's part of their function. But as even casual observers can see today, that culture and politics intermingle, and so museums oftentimes become alert to those things. And what that ends up meaning is that museums can oftentimes be overly impacted by current political trends. And these trends tend to change, and so museums whipsaw back and forth, and they're, from my point of view, the primary mission is often lost or submerged. And the other part of, in addition to just the trendiness and the which distorts the mission of the museum, the current atmosphere of identity-based politics, group identity becomes more and more divergent. We have all kinds of competing interests now, and to address all those becomes impossible. So the focus seems to inevitably become the focus of the staff of the museum. Whatever their political interests are become paramount. And eventually that can, because there can obviously be issues among staff in any organization. So oftentimes it becomes literally about the staff members, and you see that, and so the goal of the museum, the purpose of the museum, seems to celebrate the staff and their groups, whatever those groups are, and that oftentimes is interesting as that might be. Depending on the museum, I can name a few. I'm not going to today, but you end up not really. For somebody like me, they don't really serve me anymore. They serve a different audience. And that's troubling because this trend is increasing, not decreasing, and I see it with more frequency. And the other thing that is concerning is museums who are keepers of the past in some extent are losing interest in the past. A lot of the political trends today look, as is always the case, our interest seem transcendent. But especially today, the past is denigrated, and at least in the United States. And so things in the past are especially held in contempt by some, and by some museums, which makes it a very jarring experience. One last thing I want to kind of talk about museums that have nothing to do with politics, but it does have to do with the mission of museums. And clearly, museums feel like they must reach out, increase their members and viewers and visitors in a lot of ways, and they're competing with popular culture. Personally, I think it's a lost cause. I think it's a wasted effort, and efforts in that direction tend to dilute the quality of the museum. One area in particular is kind of schizophrenic when you visit museums. So the museum positions itself to attract people who are really not knowledgeable about art or interested about art. So how they do that is to make the museum about the visitors. And so you see a lot of interactive things with the visitors who feel like they can, what they do is museum worthy, and other things to get visitors to interact with the museum. And one consequence is a sort of a schizophrenia. On the one hand, visitors are urged to participate, touch, and take over. And on the other hand, out of museums who do this tend to have these things confined to certain areas. And outside of that areas, there's guards circling around everyone with instructions not to touch and don't get too close. And so it's a very schizophrenic feeling when you go to museums. I think it's actually getting worse in terms of controlling visitors, because you encourage young people especially to participate and touch, and then you direct them to the rest of the museum where that's not the way to behave. So what happens? Well, you can imagine what happens. And the guards are not they're not the police. They're not equipped to handle unruly visitors who don't understand why they can't interact with the paintings and the statues especially. So it can be a problem. And some museums handle it better than others, clearly, if you visited museums as much as I do. I want to provide one more criticism of museums. If you look at museum websites, it's clear that a lot of them were developed in the early days of internet interactivity. There's still a lot of flash sites out there, and the designs are clumsy compared to today's standards. And part of that is because today's standards are based on dynamic content, and if you know anything about IT, developing dynamic content is more complicated far and away above the simple websites of the past. And it's a tough thing to fix because museums do not have those orders of technical knowledge, and the people who do have the technical knowledge may not necessarily appreciate what would make a good site for a museum. And clearly, there's some IT firms that have seen an opportunity here in this space to provide service to museums. So you see sort of a lot of the same kind of rather subpar website design for museums. Searching, for example, should be really easy and work well, and oftentimes that's not the case. What you see instead is slow acting websites that are high on or are very confusing. So that's enough museum criticism. Let me loop back to where I came in. Why I love museums and art museums, not all of them, but most of them, and why I visit them. And I think it would be a tremendous loss if we didn't preserve that. And I don't know what folks like me would do in the future if we didn't have places where we could go and feed our hunger for art and I guess we could say beauty. Well, finally, let me end this podcast episode the same way I ended the last one, the initial Turpentine Diaries podcast, which was with a technical question I received from a blog reader. I'm still feeling my way about podcasting, trying to figure out the best format. The question I get frequently, and one I got recently, is why is drawing so important to art? And that question really is not only interesting, but it is central, in my view, to art. And the answer is that drawing, and therefore art itself, is akin to caricature. It's not about reproducing appearances as much as it is characterizing what your subject is. That's really the heart of art. If you can caricature, then we call that talent. And that's why artists like Toulouse-Lautrec, Damier, Callot, artists who, with simple seeming means, capture the nature of their topic. Those artists are regarded highly because of that skill, that talent. And that's is true for all types of art, including landscape painting, portraiture, um, and by saying caricature, I don't mean in a comic way, of course. So that's certainly one way that you can express this. But think about the character of a landscape, and the great landscape painters exhibit this. A Corot, a Habima, Ruisdael, all of these landscape painters present a kind of unique character and flavor to a landscape. It has a personality, and that is not the goal so much as just the nature, the start and end of art. And sometimes it's appropriate to capture appearances more than other times. If you're doing a quick study, a sketch, charcoal, you want to get that caricature quickly. Get the character, the figure, the landscape, the still life, whatever it is. Another artist who expresses this pretty well is Cézanne. All of his paintings are caricatures of his subject, and that's why he has a sense of such drama and importance to even mundane topics. He always painted, such as still lifes. And Chardin is another example, in my view. So they may not, when you hear caricature, you might think comic or something like that. But I think if you think about it, you can get the gist of it. And people who are new to art, or maybe haven't heard it expressed this way, might think that drawing is a tedious representation of appearances, and that's far from the truth. Anyway, thanks for listening, everyone. I think we're going to wrap up this episode here.